Hi, I'm Alison Ellis of Floral Artistry with Maricela Eman of Eman Events. Hi, Maricela.
Hi.
We were live last week to talk about some new safety guidelines and how you might move forward with your wedding. And we wanted to come back in here and talk to you a little bit about assessing your own risk if you are going to move forward with a wedding or event at this point. So there are really a couple of things that we want to touch on. It's about assessing your own risk because, as we know, right, there aren't as many guidelines as people wish. Or the guidelines that do exist are a little confusing, sometimes even feel conflicting, right? So we just want to talk about how you might assess your own risk and whether or not you want to move forward. And if so, how you can do that in a way that reduces your own risk and the risk of your guests. So we know that there is risk, right? That is something Maricela and I have been talking for weeks. And if there's one thing she has taught me, it is that there is no such thing as a risk-free event. So we know that there are going to be risks moving forward. We know it's not recommended for people to get together in large groups. So you have a choice to make now. If you are allowed to, right? If the guidelines say you can, how do you choose whether to move forward and how to go about doing that? So there are really four main things that we want you to consider in any kind of assessment that you're doing for your own event. So one is going to be the travel. Do you have to travel? Do your guests have to travel? If so, will they need to quarantine? Are they prepared to do that? And also, of course, keeping in mind that the rules as they exist today may change by the time that your event or your wedding comes up. So are you prepared to roll with those punches, right? And adjust your plans as necessary. The second thing is going to be any restrictions or guidelines. Are you willing to follow those? Are you able to follow those? Then it's about assessing your own risk and the health risk to your guests if you have anybody who's in a vulnerable population. And then it's about the precautions that you yourself will take, right? What will you do to ensure that your guests feel safe and to make it so that you're reducing risk as much as possible? So what do you say, Maricela? Have I missed anything here?
No, I think you're covering all the main aspects of this and, kind of touching back on the travel. We know that Vermont has loosened a little bit the travel restrictions that we do have, along with the quarantine requirements for traveling into state. And you can do that at the ACCD website, where it specifies the counties in neighboring states that you're allowed to come into the state without any quarantine. That being said, if you're coming from states outside of that or counties that are in the higher risks, this is where you really need to assess whether or not you want to move forward, if you're now or as you move closer to the date, if those things change. So where are your guests coming from? Where are you coming from? And really pinpointing whether or not that risk for you personally is worth it. Or the additional quarantine, right?
That's right. So like, as you pointed out, the ACCD website is updated regularly, like every week or even more than that if it has to be, I would assume, if anything were to change midweek. Usually I feel like it's Friday that it gets updated. I don't know that for certain, but it sort of seems that way. So you can check every week to see what the travel guidelines are and if they have changed in any way.
Yes.
So travel is a big factor because, like you said, will you or your guests be willing to quarantine either once you get here or when you go home? That's going to be not a small factor for people when they're considering whether they want to host or attend an event.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Why don't we hop over to thinking about like restrictions and guidelines? What do we need to consider when we're assessing our risk there?
For current guidelines for the state of Vermont do allow indoor gatherings of 75, so max 75 guests, and maximum of 150 outdoors with specified square foot per person or 50% of the fire safety allowance or the occupancy allowance for that space. Again, with your max of 75 indoors and 150 outdoors. With your social distancing as well in those factors. So if your venue, your space, your tent is not going to allow you to meet those guidelines, this is where you need to start adjusting your guest counts, your guest lists, or your tent size, and so on. And it's kind of like an easy factor moving forward. It's if you can't make those adjustments, you should at that point decide to maybe move the date or reduce to, a smaller wedding, elopement, or any of these other options that we have nowadays. On top of that,
I'm sorry to interrupt. So reducing the size is a really important piece of the guidelines right now. If you want to get married inside, or for example, under a tent that has sides, if you're doing a September or October wedding, you probably want your tent to have sides because of the weather. So that'll create an indoor sort of environment, right? You've got 4 sides and a roof. So that would be 75 people in that space. So, we have to really be mindful of what are we really looking to max out the space and fit as many people in here as we can. According to Dr. Fauci, we're not really looking to do that right now, right? We're not looking to max out our space capacity. So how small are you willing to go would be a really important question to ask yourself. How much are you willing to reduce your guest count in order to proceed? Let's get to more restrictions and guidelines. Aside from the spacing, the social distancing that will be required, the capacity that will be something to consider for indoors or outdoors. What about what other guidelines are we thinking about in terms of service, right? We are not having buffets, we're not having open air food happening.
So this, this specific, your food service has to be in line with the restaurant guidelines for service during a pandemic. And that needs to translate over to your catering. So how do you adjust that? Talking to your caterer, making sure that you're all on the same page about this, but also taking into consideration that changing your food service style might cause an increase on your per person cost. So does your budget have this flexibility in that as well? So there's multiple things to consider in that. For that specific area. Eliminating any high touch is really kind of your key point there. Any buffets, as you mentioned, food displays, those are really things that are not, you're not going to see in the foreseeable future, actually.
Right. And we're not looking to have multiple people touching the same spoon.
No.
Not going to do it. In terms of, are there any other things you're thinking in terms of the restrictions or guidelines that we want to be mindful of as we're assessing our risk?
The face covering mandates for not only the state, but specifically counties and towns around the state of Vermont have their own specific restrictions around that, or mandates. Some have made it mandatory in certain areas and in certain situations. So just keeping up to date with that and communicating that fact with your guests as well. If face masks or face coverings are required for your specific venue, then you need to make sure that you let your guests know that so that they can either adhere to it or maybe decide not to come if they don't want to meet those guidelines.
That's right. So you're leading perfectly into, as always, you give me the perfect segue into, with the communication that goes to what precautions will you take? What are you willing to do in your own risk assessment that may go above and beyond what you're told you have to do, right? So for example, we were looking at a really great example from a Vermont couple who sent out a safety guideline to their guests, and they explained how it's going to work. We've got people here on staff who are ready to do everything they can to keep you safe here. We made face masks and you're going to be wearing them. So if you don't want to do these things, don't come. Like they were really straightforward with people what they expect. They're like, this is a weird, tricky time, but we want to get married and we're going to do this. And it's only under these conditions. So they communicated that safety plan to their guests in a clear way where if you're not wearing it, you say, I'm not wearing a mask. Well, then don't come. They told you that right there. Don't come. So again, we heard the other day, if you are going to gather, you should wear a face mask, right? Even if it's not required, what you should do and what you have to do aren't always going to line up, right? The right thing and what's required aren't always the same thing. Let me let you talk more about communication and how to communicate with guests or vendors.
So vendors, actually, very specifically, especially your venue. Certain venues, just like any other business in Vermont, they have the choice to adhere or require certain safety measures for any event or for their services in general, for their business operations. So if a business feels or deems it as a mandatory aspect to wear face coverings or to limit the amount of people that are gathering in their spaces, you have to kind of be understanding of that as well. As business owners and employers, they have to keep in mind the safety of their employees as well. So just considering those facts and communicating that with your vendors, not only your venue, but your photographer, your makeup artist, anyone that's going to be in close contact with you or your guests, making sure you understand how are they proceeding from here.
Yeah, because people have to assess their own risk as employers or as business owners, and everyone's different, right? We did this the other day thanks to the Johns Hopkins assessment that you shared. So for me as a florist, my risk was low. I'm a 4 on the scale of risk, whereas the makeup artist was like a 14. She was a way higher risk. And I shouldn't say she or he is a higher risk. And then when it came to photographers and venue owners and wedding planners, they were all in that moderate range between like 7 to 9. So you can get a sense of how everyone really does have to take their own risk into account, whether you're the couple who's planning the wedding or you're the vendor who is considering whether you should work at a wedding or not.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add there on communication?
No, I think we've covered a lot to do there. Again, yes, actually, one more thing. So in that communication with your guests, when you're arranging your seating assignments, make sure that you're communicating with them if you will be sitting households together. Address this. And if anyone selects or lets you know that they'd rather sit on their own at their own table, try to make those adjustments on your seating plan, which will affect your layout, your spacing, how many guests you're actually allowed in that vicinity if you're sitting in smaller groups and that sort of thing. So it's things to, again, consider as you're deciding to move forward and if you're able to make those adjustments.
Yeah. And you know what, that you actually bring up something I hadn't thought of, which is that extra level of communication of asking somebody, what are you comfortable with?
Yes.
Are you comfortable sitting with Aunt Joe or, who do you want to sit with? Or are you like, no, I don't trust Aunt Joe. She's been in the nail salon 5 times I'm not doing that. Like you could be that considerate and ask, who they're comfortable with instead of assuming, who they're comfortable with. Right.
Yes, because to tell you, as a planner, I've made adjustments very last minute, but switching tables and having the equipment to make smaller groupings doesn't happen last minute. So you need to communicate that with your guests so that then you can communicate with your vendors.
That's right. Because it's not like in the olden times, like 2019, where you could just change the seating card. You literally have to maybe get a different table, get a new chair, you need a new linen. Like it's a whole nother thing. It's not just, hey, could we switch seats? That's not going to fly. The final thing that we wanted to talk about, which is not small, is your own personal vulnerability or risk. Are you a high risk individual? Are your parents, are your grandparents, are your guests in a high risk category? So you're super well versed in this. Now I'm putting you on the spot here because we didn't talk about this ahead of time. Do you want to rattle off who those high risk people are? Because I know you know who the vulnerable populations are. 60 plus, I know that.
Yes, 65 plus. But then again, you have to assess individuals in there. But 65 plus, and then anybody with underlying health conditions, things that are going to put them at higher risk, people with severe pulmonary issues or breathing issues, diabetes, cancer, asthma. So other, and it goes on and on from there. You can find on the CDC has your specific guidelines on who is at higher risk. So you can go into there, and it has each, health condition has their own link, which then goes into more detail. So you can really, really get down into the nitty gritty on who has the higher risk or not. As well, for me personally, looking at your guest list and such, are you going to have children in attendance? Although children are not necessarily higher risk, are you able to kind of mandate the social distancing with children present?
Right.
Things to consider. I have toddlers. There is no way that they're not going to touch other people. That's just that's just how it's going to go. So, things to consider on that side as well. But again, look at your demographic, who makes up your guest list, where they're coming from, and what associated risks that they may have.
Yeah. And as we say that, you and I we're too informed to not also mention that you don't have to be in a high risk population to get COVID-19. The stories now that are most recent are like a lot of younger people are getting it. The 18-ish age right now are the people who are getting it and passing it around, right? Even if they're not showing symptoms. And I don't want to sound like that's brand new news, but it's a little more obvious right now that you don't have to be vulnerable to be someone who carries this and spreads this. And that's really what the risk assessment is about, you guys. It's about deciding if you need to move forward, and if you need to move forward, how you can do that safely, and taking in all of these different considerations, because it's not just one thing. It's not just, well, you can have up to 150 people outside, so it's go time, right? It's not that easy. It'd be nice if it were that easy, but it's not. You have to know, are you vulnerable? Are you going to communicate? And will your guests participate in doing social distancing, wearing masks, doing whatever is required, again, at the time of your wedding? Because one thing you said when we were chatting before this is, do you want to decide now that you want to postpone, or do you want to wait a month and decide? So people can wait to decide to postpone, but what's happening now isn't necessarily what's going to happen in a month or 2 months from now. Things could be more strict, things could be less strict. You still need to know how you want to proceed regardless of the guidelines.
Absolutely. And it's a very key point there. Staying up to date on the information is really, really, really key in deciding.
Like the travel information, the lodging information, because we didn't even get into the lodging. Can you come here? But then where are you going to stay? How are you going to do that, right? So you have to keep up on all these things. The best place to go, right? The place to get this information is on the ACCD website. So that's ACCD, what is it, .gov? Should I have looked this up before I started saying it out loud?
Yeah.
I've looked it up so many times that when I just hit ACCD, it like comes right up to the
ACCD.vermont.gov.
Okay. So ACCD.vermont.gov. Let me put that right here because it is important. Vermont.gov. And we want to make sure that that's where you go to get any kind of update that you need. So for example, if you want to know, can I travel to Vermont from Texas or California? go to acc.vermont.gov and you'll see the information right there on the COVID-19 page, on the WorkSafe page. They're pretty great actually about how they link everything together. If you want to know what the wedding restrictions or guidelines are, you'll find them on that website. If you want to know lodging, it's there. If you want to know what the catering and restaurant guidelines are, they're all right there on that same page. So you can stay up to date simply by following this one link and keeping up with it every day like we do.
Yeah. We'll probably, I'm most likely going to continue posting on my personal website and on, the Vermont Facebook pages that we have for weddings and couples, and posting any updates that we know of. And there's a lot of communication in that sense. So hopefully we're able to keep up with it as well as you, so that we're able to make, more informed decisions as we move forward.
And you're at eamonevents.com.
Yes.
So if you go to eamonevents.com, you're going to find safety updates. You're going to find, she's got a great slideshow on how to move forward, like what you might want to consider. You're going to have a quiz up there. I'm saying it. We didn't even talk it. I'm teasing it. There's going to be a quiz to help you assess your own risk. So check out Eamon Events for additional updates. But if you want the straight skinny from the state, that's going to be at accd.vermont.gov. Is there anything else that you're thinking we should talk about or before we wrap up?
So just one thing. So if you do decide to move forward and that you're willing to make those adjustments and that your risk level is low and that your guests are willing to make those accommodations to meet these requirements, look at how you can creatively put forth these guidelines. The health and safety doesn't have to be sterile. This is something that we talked about just recently. It doesn't have to be sterile. And looking at your signage, looking at the way that you sit people, your offerings, your face masks, why not personalize them?
Yeah.
Things like that you can look to create more of an appeal, like an actual visual appeal for the guests that do come and join you for your celebration, making that more comfortable for them as well. And so, there's a lot of fun things out there. Pinterest, go for it.
And that's the thing. We need to recognize that it's up to us to, again, communicate with our guests, make them feel safe, make them feel welcome, because who is going to come and travel if they don't feel safe and welcome? And so once they've actually made the decision, they're coming, they've maybe booked a hotel, or if you're local, they've decided we're doing this, right? We're going out, we're doing this thing. You want to make sure that when they get there, they know that you thought about them, that you are continuing to think about them all night, that you're not going to forget about them, that you're not going to later on, the social distancing is off. You have to make sure that you're clear about what your expectations are, and then keep your guests safe to the best of your ability, because there's no such thing as eliminating risk. It's only managing risk, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Anything else you want to say before we sign off and let these people assess their risk?
No, not at the moment. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, this is a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. We were live last week. If you missed it, you can find it on my Facebook page. You can find it on YouTube. I'll probably, wherever you're watching this, I will post a link to the other video with it so that you're not like, I missed it. No, there's a replay and you can watch it anytime. We just want you to be safe and informed, because there is risk. And so you really do need to accept and understand it. Know the symptoms, know the signs, have a plan. Your vendors need a plan. Everyone needs to know what is going to happen at your event so that everybody can stay as safe as possible.
Absolutely.
Awesome. We may have to do another one of these next week. So we'll see you next time for the Safety Show live with Maricela and Alison. Stay safe, celebrate safe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
If you're planning a Vermont wedding or event, that website again is accd.vermont.gov. You can click right here on the COVID-19 resources page, and you'll find guidelines for the Restart WorkSafe guidance. This has information on every sector that might affect your wedding or event, including the cross-state travel information, so you are up to date on the most current mandates and guidelines from the state of Vermont. Don't forget to head over to emanevents.com and click on the COVID-19 resources page right here on the homepage. When you get there, what you will find are some additional resources to help you make decisions around safety and risk assessment for your wedding or event, including the new quiz, should I postpone, information for vendors, what will your wedding day look like, and you can even just email Maricela if you have any questions about moving forward with your wedding at this time. So I really want to encourage you to check out the quiz, should you postpone? And when you get here, it's just as simple as answering a few questions. So once you answer a few questions, you'll get a score, and the score will help you decide whether you should move forward or whether you might want to postpone because the risks are just too high. So for example, if you have a good score, you could proceed with caution. You accept that you need to mitigate your damages, you accept that you need to follow guidelines, and so you're able to do your best to reduce risk during an event. However, if you don't get a high enough score, that means that you're not willing to make enough changes, or you're not able to make enough changes to your event to move forward safely, and you should consider postponing or figuring out what you need to do so that you can have a safer event. I want to really encourage vendors to click on that vendor information tab, because you can get a free infectious disease preparedness and response plan that is free, and just click right here to grab it. It's a really great plan, and every business needs a plan for how you will move forward in a pandemic if you're trying to do a wedding or event. So just make sure you head over to Eman Events, take advantage of these resources, and be smart and celebrate safe, okay? Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.